It is with inexpressible pain that I inform Your Excellency of the mutiny which took place in the Pennsylvania line last evening. Every possible exertion was made to suppress it, but the torrent was too potent to be stemmed. General Anthony Wayne.
On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania Continentals, a full quarter of Washington's army, finally lost faith. They had not been paid in 12 months, yet their government was offering $81 in cash to recruit convicts willing to trade a jail cell for an army jacket. As night fell in Morristown, New Jersey, 1,500 soldiers seized artillery, gunpowder, and cannonballs and filed out of camp. They intended to march to Philadelphia and lay their grievances directly before the Pennsylvania State Council and the Congress. 2 officers who tried to stop them were wounded. A third was killed. Word of the mutiny reached the British in New York. The commander, General Henry Clinton, immediately dispatched a loyalist named John Mason to tempt the mutineers with amnesty and money if they would switch sides. But these rebels were mutineers, not traitors. Defection, once called turning coat, was now known as turning Arnold. The soldiers arrested Mason and his guide. 3 days later, both men were convicted as spies and hanged from a tree by a horse's collar. On January 6th, officials from Congress and the state of Pennsylvania arrived to hear the mutineers' complaints. The soldiers claimed they had enlisted for 3 years and their term was up. The officials insisted they had signed on for the duration of the war. After 2 days of negotiation, the soldiers won their point. More than 1,300 men were given the right to re-enlist or leave as they saw fit. Most re-enlisted. Just as the mutiny seemed at an end, 200 New Jersey Continentals marched out of their camp.
Now, for George Washington, this is intolerable. A pattern is starting to show up here. He's not going to tolerate that. So he just absolutely drops the hammer on that. He sends 2 divisions down. They surround them. They crush the mutiny. I mean, the guys never have a chance to even really articulate their demands before they're surrounded. The sergeants who were the, quote, ringleaders are identified. 3 are picked by lot. And the rest of the ringleaders are told, you're the firing squad. They make their fellow sergeants shoot their own friends.
Being themselves guilty, they were greatly distressed with the duty imposed upon them. And when ordered to load, some of them shed tears. The wretched victims, overwhelmed by the terrors of death, had neither time nor power to implore mercy and forgiveness of their God. Dr. James Thatcher.
While George Washington was wrestling with mutinies, a fleet bearing 1,200 British troops sailed into the Chesapeake Bay to raid Virginia. In command, in his first action as a British general, was Benedict Arnold. Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson, due to what he later called fatal inattention, waited 3 days before calling out the militia. Time enough for Arnold to sail up the James River to within 30 miles of the capital, Richmond. Driving his soldiers overnight through a rainstorm, Arnold arrived to find the city defended by a scant 200 men, who promptly fled. He asked a local citizen what the Virginians would do if they ever caught the great Benedict Arnold. The rebel replied they'd cut off his left leg, the one wounded at Quebec and Saratoga, and bury it with full military honors. The rest of him, they would hang. In 1781, General Washington was entering his third year of stalemate against the British in New York. Both sides were dug in for defense, but neither had the strength to attack. For Washington, the period of watching and waiting was the hardest struggle he had endured. Finally, after a year of treason, mutiny, and deadlock, Washington received good news. Congress agreed to name his favorite general commander of the Southern Army. From the first day he met Nathanael Greene in 1775, Washington had liked the Quaker who renounced pacifism to fight for the Revolution.
Nathanael Greene had no military experience prior to the Revolution. He was a man who stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, somewhat stocky build, blue-gray eyes, a man who walked with a slight limp. But despite the fact that he had little experience and was not initially impressive, within a year or so, Greene did begin to impress others. And Washington himself, later in the war, said that he hoped if something happened to him, that Greene would be his successor.
As quartermaster at Valley Forge, he had kept thousands of men from starving. Now he faced his greatest challenge, retaking the South. From West Point, Greene confided to his wife, Kitty.
My dearest angel, what I have been dreading has come to pass. His Excellency General Washington, by order of Congress, has appointed me to command the Southern Army. I have been pleasing myself with the agreeable prospect of spending the winter here with you. How unfriendly is war to happiness?
When Nathanael Greene arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina to take command of the so-called Grand Army of the Southern Department of the United States of America, he found only 1,500 men. It was, Greene reported, but the shadow of an army in the midst of distress, wretched beyond description. Barely half the men were properly clothed or equipped, and when Greene arrived, they had exactly 3 days' supply of food. For every sorry scarecrow Greene could muster, Lord Cornwallis had 3 well-fed regulars. Greene responded to his predicament with the most daring strategy of the Revolution. Already outnumbered 3 to 1, he decided to split his force.
Right about? Hey!
By the books, this was suicide. But Greene believed the gamble would save his army. He sent the frontier general Daniel Morgan west with 600 men, while he went east with the rest of the army.
It makes the most of my inferior force, for it compels my adversary to divide his. He cannot leave Morgan behind him in order to come at me. And he cannot chase Morgan far while I am here with the whole country open before me. I am in no danger. Nathanael Greene.
When Cornwallis learned that Greene had split his pathetic force, he didn't believe it. But he took the bait and split his army. On New Year's Day, 1781, he sent Tarleton and 1,000 men to find Daniel Morgan and crush him. Morgan was near the Broad River in South Carolina when an express rider brought word from General Greene.
Colonel Tarleton is said to be on his way to pay you a visit. I doubt not, but he will have a decent reception.
For several days, Morgan let Tarleton pursue him. Then he turned and made his stand at a place called the Cowpens. It was a sparsely wooded pasture. It looked like the worst possible place for foot soldiers to take on cavalrymen. Cowpens also backed up against the Broad River, leaving his men no retreat. But Morgan had chosen this trap on purpose. Almost half his men were raw militia, likely to run at the first pop of a gun. As Morgan observed, men fight as much as they find necessary, and no more. When men are forced to fight, they will sell their lives dearly.
Dan Morgan invented a new way to teach how to fight to militiamen, and it was to know who could do what, and then never ask a man to do more than he was physically capable of doing. So the night before the Battle of Cowpens, Morgan made the rounds of all the campfires, told each unit, this is exactly what I want you to do, and I don't expect you to stand and fight, militiaman. It's okay after you've shot your 2 rounds to run away.
The next morning, an hour before daylight, scouts reported that the British were just 5 miles away and closing fast. Morgan formed his men in 3 lines, 150 sharpshooters in front, the militia in the middle, and behind them, 450 steadfast Continentals. The riflemen fired first. Then the militia fired their 2 volleys as ordered and withdrew. Mistaking their withdrawal for a retreat, Tarleton ordered a charge and slammed straight into the line of Continentals. When the American line stood fast, Tarleton sent in his Highlanders. Now the Continentals fell back. Tarleton, seeing another apparent retreat, pursued. Suddenly, at a deadly range, the entire American line turned and fired.
Tom Sion. The Americans just blew Tarleton away. And that's the reason Cowpens is such a great tactical and strategic victory for the Americans, because one of the few times in the war you can actually see that the Americans effectively used the linear tactics and beat the British at their own game.
Dan Morgan, in the space of about 35 or 40 minutes, just delivered, after Washington's victory at Trenton, the second most decisive battlefield defeat on the British of the Revolution. He has smashed an elite British force, totally crippled them.
Morgan captured or killed more than 800 men, 90% of Tarleton's force. In England, politician Horace Walpole, a rebel sympathizer, received the news with a typically wry remark.
America is once more not quite ready to be conquered, although every now and then we fancy it is. Tarleton is defeated. Lord Cornwallis is checked. And Arnold, not sure of having betrayed his friends to much purpose.
Two days after Daniel Morgan's victory at Cowpens, Cornwallis ordered his army on the march. He expected Morgan to be moving slowly, savoring his victory. Cornwallis planned to intercept him near Cowpens on the only road leading to the main American army. But Morgan had already put 100 miles behind him and was rejoining Nathanael Greene. Cornwallis was now more determined than ever to chase down the rebels. But weighed down by the baggage of a formal field army, he was moving too slowly. To convert his army into fast-moving light troops, he spent 2 days burning every expendable item.
Without baggage, necessaries, or provisions in the most barren, unhealthy part of North America, with zeal only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world. General Charles O'Hara.
When Nathanael Greene heard that Cornwallis was pursuing him, he confounded his officers by exclaiming, "Then he is ours."
Greene says, okay, I'm not going to try to stand and fight. I'm going to start backing up. And I'm going to get Cornwallis trying to catch me. And I'm going to let him waste all his energy. So Greene starts marching back towards the North Carolina-Virginia border, the Dan River.
Greene instructed a Polish volunteer, engineer Tadeusz Kosciuszko, to map the fords of every major river between the American army and the Dan, and to commandeer every boat he could find. For the men of both armies, the 4-week race to the Dan was as grueling as any march in the war. 200 miles in rain and snow, on red clay roads that were icy by night and muddy by day. On St. Valentine's Night, 1781, the first Americans reached the Dan. Kosciuszko was waiting with the boats. At midnight, Cornwallis's horsemen raced up to the south shore just in time to see the last boat in the region, landing the last Americans on the far bank. Although not a single Continental remained south of Virginia, the drive to expel them had left the British Army destitute, just as Greene intended. Cornwallis had burned all his provisions and raced his men 200 miles for nothing. Cornwallis turned back to rest his army. 10 days later, Greene recrossed the Dan and followed him. For 3 weeks, one army shadowed the other, Cornwallis seeking battle, and Greene avoiding it while he waited for reinforcements. In early March, they arrived. Now, with 4,000 men, he outnumbered the British for the first time. On March 14th, 1781, Greene stopped running. He chose a strong position at Guilford Courthouse, only 12 miles from his enemy's camp, and waited. The next morning, Cornwallis roused his troops before breakfast and marched on Guilford Courthouse. He had only half as many men as Greene, but they were seasoned veterans, and he was eager for battle. Half of Greene's men were untested militia, and he deployed them in the same formation Daniel Morgan used to win Cowpens.
You have a great number of militia. If they fight, you beat Cornwallis. If not, he will beat you. Put the militia in the center with some picked troops in their rear with orders to shoot down the first man that runs. Daniel Morgan.
At 1:30, the British attacked. The first line of militia had barely fired a shot when they saw the British come on with fixed bayonets.
To our infinite distress and mortification, the North Carolina militia took flight. Throwing away arms, knapsacks, and even canteens, they rushed like a torrent headlong through the woods. Colonel Henry Lee.
The first line breaks and runs too quickly, but the second line, which is composed of the Virginia militia under the command of ex-Continentals with a lot of Continental veterans, stands and fights in place for nearly an hour.
The British and Americans collided in a deadly battle of attrition. Outnumbered and getting the worst of the fight, Cornwallis resorted to the unthinkable. He ordered his artillery to fire at the Americans over the heads of his own men, knowing full well some of the shells would fall short.
Cornwallis, out of desperation, facing total defeat, shoots down a large chunk of his own force.
It was a drastic measure, but it worked. The Americans abandoned the field. Cornwallis claimed the victory, but at a terrible price. 500 casualties, 1/4 of his army. Six weeks after conquering the Carolinas, Cornwallis abandoned them for the safety and provisions of Virginia.
It's an interesting contrast, I think, between Cornwallis and General Nathaniel Greene on the American side, his chief opponent for much of the war in the South. Greene was, in fact, able to lose most of the battles he fought and yet succeed in winning the campaigns. Cornwallis's epitaph perhaps would be that he won the battles but failed to win the campaigns.
3 days after Guilford Courthouse and 6 years after joining the war, Nathaniel Greene wrote with despair to his wife in Rhode Island.
My dear, we've had a very severe action with Lord Cornwallis. Nothing but blood slaughter prevails here. I should be happy on a farm with my family about me. God grant the day may not be far distant, when peace, with all her blessings, shall diffuse joy through America.
General George Washington had spent more than 2.5 years deadlocked with the British at New York. The commander-in-chief had been waiting for the great promise of the Franco-American alliance to bear fruit. The French had delivered an army, but no navy, and he knew that until he had ships to match England's, there would be no harvest of victory. At At last, in the spring of 1781, the influential French commander in America, General de Rochambeau, arranged the gift Washington longed for. 30 warships under the Admiral Comte de Grasse were sailing from the West Indies for America. But there were two conditions. First, the fleet could be spared from the Caribbean for only 2 months in early fall, the hurricane season. Second, de Grasse would not risk his ships in the rough waters and shallow harbor of New York. Washington abandoned his plans to retake New York and concentrated on a more promising target, the 8,000-man army of Lord Cornwallis, now at Yorktown, Virginia. The calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay would be agreeable to Admiral de Grasse. On August 19th, French and American troops marched away from New York. The Allied army had 400 miles to cover to rendezvous with the French fleet. But there had been no word of the fleet since it left the West Indies. "I am distressed beyond expression," wrote Washington, "to know what is become of the Count de Grasse." Unbeknownst to the American commander-in-chief, de Grasse was already in the Chesapeake. He had driven off a British fleet and now controlled the bay. Cornwallis was trapped. He could no longer escape by sea, and his exit by land was blocked by the approaching armies of Rochambeau and Washington. On October 6th, Washington personally broke ground for the largest siege that had ever occurred on American soil. By October 9th, the fortifications were complete. Washington himself would light the first cannon. The Allies fired a shell every minute, around the clock. Cornwallis himself was forced to abandon his headquarters for a bunker underground. By mid-October, the only obstacles between the Americans and victory were two fortifications, redoubts number 9 and 10. Washington decided to storm them under the cover of night. On October 14th, a French battalion moved on number 9, while 400 Americans under 24-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton crept toward redoubt number 10. To ensure that no accidental firing would alert the British, his men left their muskets unloaded. The Americans would fight this battle with the weapon they once feared most, the bayonet. One of the Americans wounded at Redoubt 10 would receive a new medal for his valor. It was called the Purple Heart.
There's no question that the greatest tactical moment in the siege of Yorktown comes in the capture of redoubts 9 and 10. For one thing, it's the culminating moment. When those redoubts fall, Cornwallis's defense is literally doomed. He can't hold out anymore.
On October 15th, his ammunition exhausted and his defenses in ruins, Cornwallis wrote to General Clinton in New York.
My situation now becomes very critical. We shall soon be exposed to an assault in ruined works, in a bad position. I cannot recommend endeavoring to save us.
Two days later, a drummer boy mounted the parapet, beating a parley. He could not be heard over the thunder of cannon, but he could be seen. The guns fell silent. Then a British officer appeared, waving a white handkerchief. The nearest American officer blindfolded him and took him to Washington's headquarters. Cornwallis requested a 24-hour ceasefire to negotiate surrender. Among his terms, he asked that his vanquished army be paroled to Britain. Washington refused. Thousands of Americans captured at Charleston after the humiliating surrender were still rotting away in British prisons. Washington demanded unconditional surrender. Within hours, Cornwallis submitted. On October 19th, more than 7,000 British and Germans sullenly trudged onto the field of surrender.
The British in general behaved like boys who'd been whipped at school. Some bit their lips, some pouted, others cried.
Cornwallis's second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, approached Rochambeau, carrying the sword of surrender. But the French general indicated George Washington. Washington deferred to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, the general Cornwallis humiliated at Charleston. Lincoln accepted the sword, ceremonially handed it back, and announced the surrender. George Washington proudly sent formal notice to Philadelphia.
I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected.
The Marquis de Lafayette put it more simply. The play, sir, is over. When word of the surrender at Yorktown reached London, the Prime Minister, Lord North, took the news as if he'd been shot. "Oh, God," he cried, "it is all over." King George was more practical.
When men are a little recovered from the shock, they will then find the necessity of carrying on the war.
Both men were right.
Yorktown, in effect, brought the Anglo-American aspect of the war to an end. The British, quite simply, lost the will to carry on contesting for the American colonies. They had to divert resources to fighting the French and the Spanish and the Dutch.
The struggle in America was virtually over, but England fought on to preserve the rest of her empire. Battles raged from Honduras to Gibraltar, from Guadeloupe to Ceylon. 8 years after the war began on Lexington Green, the final shot of the American Revolution was fired 11,000 miles away at Cuddalore, India. In the World War, the British were victorious.
George III's reign, for better or for worse, was one of the most successful reigns in British history. There was only, in a sense, one failure in that reign, and that was that the attempt to suppress the colonial revolution did not succeed.
By the summer of 1783, Benjamin Franklin had been negotiating peace terms with England for more than a year. Before the talks ended, nearly 100,000 American loyalists would become exiles. No longer welcome among their neighbors, they left behind their houses, their homeland, and their American dreams, and sailed for Nova Scotia, or the West Indies, or England.
The Loyalists, there is about them a kind of poignant, absolute sense that they had done nothing wrong. They did not understand why they had become victims of this great tragedy.
On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Peace between the world's greatest power and a nation of farmers was at last signed in Paris. On December 4th, 1783, from New York Harbor, the last British ship left the United States of America. Blocks away in a hushed room at Fraunce's Tavern, George Washington bade farewell to his officers.
With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if you will come and take me by the hand.
Henry Knox was the first to approach the general. Washington began to take his hand, but was overcome with emotion. He threw his arms around his old friend and embraced him. One by one, every officer took his leave in the same tearful way. No one spoke a word.
Such a scene of sorrow I have never before witnessed. The thought that we were then about to part from the man under whose conduct the glory and independence of our country had been achieved, and that we should see his face no more, seemed to me utterly insupportable. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge.
Henry Knox succeeded George Washington as Commander-in-Chief and went on to become the nation's first Secretary of War. Supporting his troops through the Revolution left Nathaniel Greene in debt. After selling off his home in Rhode Island, the hero of the South was given a plantation by the grateful state of Georgia. He died there 1 year later at 44 of heat stroke. Thomas Paine, whose fiery words sparked a revolution, became too radical even for America. He died at 72, impoverished, alcoholic, and forgotten. After the revolution, King George III suffered from bouts of insanity, but ruled successfully for another 28 years. He lived long enough to see his son fight another war with America in 1812, with no better luck. Charles, Lord Cornwallis, was cleared of blame for the disaster of Yorktown and went on to become Governor General of the jewel of the British Crown, India. Britain never embraced the traitor Benedict Arnold. He died in England a broken and outcast man. 4 of his sons became officers in the British Army. At 82, Benjamin Franklin went on to lobby for America's Constitution, even though he opposed many of its principles, including the notion of a presidency. The Marquis de Lafayette returned to France to lead his own country's revolution. He drafted what became the preamble to the French Constitution. In it, he paid tribute to the ideals so eloquently written by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, whose most immortal words were "all men are created equal," could not bring himself to free any but 5 of his 150 slaves, even on his deathbed. Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. After 8 years of service to his country, Joseph Plum Martin became destitute and had to rely on a veteran's pension of $8 a month to support his family. After his death at the age of 89, his hometown placed a marker at his grave with the simple epitaph, "A Soldier of the Revolution." By war's end, no American was more revered than George Washington. His only dream was to go home to his beloved Mount Vernon and retire from public life forever. Many doubted he would. No general since the days of Rome had relinquished so much power, so hard won. At noon on December 23, 1783, the Commander-in-Chief presented himself to Congress. With a trembling voice, he resigned the commission he had faithfully upheld through the long war. George Washington, citizen farmer, finally rode home in time to celebrate Christmas, just as he had promised Martha 8 winters before. In 1799, at the age of 67, the man who would be called the father of his country died childless. Yet to the world, he left an immortal legacy. The citizens of America, he wrote, are now possessed of absolute freedom and independency. They are from this period to be considered as the actors on a most conspicuous theater, which seems designated by Providence for the display of human greatness. A signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, reminded his countrymen that their journey had just begun. The American war is over, he said, but this is far from the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed.